This webinar gives an overview of the Visitor Use Management Framework and tools. We'll start with an introduction to the Visitor Use Management Framework. Then we'll discuss desired conditions, indicators, and measures in a bit more detail, review a few suggestions or examples of how visitor use management data can be used to inform management decisions. And then we'll talk through some examples of using the framework with limited resources. Visitor use management has been a focus of public land providers for several decades, and there have been various frameworks proposed for evaluating issues and making decisions about how to address those issues. These frameworks all helped with providing structure and transparency in making difficult decisions about how to manage recreational visitation. However, efforts to apply these early frameworks, including the Visitor Experience and Resource Protection Framework and the Limits of Acceptable Change Framework, were identified as having several key limitations. One limitation is that these frameworks were perceived as one size fits all, with a primary focus on carrying capacity. Another key limitation was that the frameworks were overly resource intensive. They required extensive data and background research, as well as a cumbersome decision-making process. The Interagency Visitor Use Management Council arose to meet some of these concerns. This is a group that represents federal agencies, but much of their work is applicable to state or local recreation sites. Since visitor use management is a top priority for California state parks, this was an obvious framework to use in this context. The Interagency Visitor Use Management Council's mission is to provide guidance on visitor use management policies and to develop legally defensible and effective interagency implementation tools for visitor use management. Note that the framework really emphasizes defensibility, and that is because of the federal regulatory and policy context that it was created within. But regardless of whether issues and management approaches might be subject to legal challenges, this goal of having a systematic, sequential, and well-documented process for assessing and addressing visitor use management issues is applicable across the board. The Council's work is also guided by a strong recognition of the strengths that recreation providers have that are related to collecting relevant information and carrying out the planning process. We will focus on the framework in this presentation, but all of the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council's tools are available on their website, which will be linked. These resources are started with the framework, which was published in 2016. In 2019, the Council published the Monitoring Guidebook. This includes information about the why and what of monitoring, including developing a monitoring strategy, considerations for implementing monitoring, and how to use the data. In 2019, the Council published the Visitor Capacity Guidebook, which defines visitor capacity, covers best practices for identifying a visitor capacity, and talks about the implementation of visitor capacity management strategies. The Desired Conditions Guidebook was just published and takes an in-depth view of creating desired conditions, which the Council notes are the heart of the VUM. There's also a public participation process report that's in progress and will be on the Council's website when it's available. Now to take a look at the framework itself. The Visitor Use Management Framework provides the analytical elements to address visitor use management opportunities and issues. It is consistent with law and policy, and it's designed to operate within or to be implemented within existing agency management processes. The framework starts with a step of building the foundation. So during this step, you're trying to understand what needs to be done and how to organize a planning effort. Next, the next step is to define a visitor use management direction. Here we describe the desired conditions to be achieved or maintained and consider how those conditions will be tracked over time. This is the step that we've really focused on a lot in our work and that I'll elaborate on in the second section of the presentation. The third step is to identify management strategies to achieve or maintain desired conditions. And the fourth step is to implement, monitor, evaluate, and adjust based on monitoring data. And you'll note that these steps do feed into each other, so this is an iterative process. Some key things about the framework is that, first of all decisions involve trade-offs. For example, between providing access and conserving natural resources. Secondly, using many strategies and actions is typically more effective than a narrow focus on setting capacity limits. And third, it recognizes that all management decisions are ultimately value judgments. The monitoring data don't tell you what you should do. Within the framework, there are 4 universals. Number 1 is law. This establishes the overall agency scope of authority. It might create special considerations or requirements depending on the enabling legislation of the agency. Next up is agency policies, which establish the specific priorities and processes of the agency. And together, the law and the agency policies create basically the sideboards for establishing desired conditions within that park. Another very important universal in the framework is the idea of a sliding scale of analysis, which we will come back to in more detail in the next slide. And the final universal is the need for public involvement. For some agencies, this process is dictated by policies, but in other cases, there's more latitude for the type and extent of involvement. Public involvement is also linked to the sliding scale because for any situation, the nature of the issue and how they might be managed will drive the degree of public concern and contention surrounding the issue. All right, to go into more detail on the sliding scale, this is a tool or a concept within the framework that helps us consider what level of analysis we need and to really try to fit our effort, data collection, and analysis to the issue at hand. So when we're thinking about the sliding scale, we're considering 4 different factors. The first is the level of controversy and potential for litigation that surrounds the issue. For example, if we're thinking about a park that allows off-leash dogs implementing a leash or a dog ban, that has the potential to be a very controversial issue. Versus if we are trying to implement a rule about no glass on the beach, that's likely to be less controversial. The second factor that we're considering here is impact risk. So we're thinking about if there are considerable threats to the quality of resource conditions, such as endangered species, and if there are threats to visitor experience. This isn't necessarily a question that can be analyzed by data alone. It also needs to be informed by law and policy, as well as public input. Our third consideration is issue uncertainty. So we want to ask, what is the level of uncertainty we have about the issue? In some cases, there might be a great deal of uncertainty or of certainty. For example, if you are talking about a park where you know that parking lots are full each weekend and that people are lining cars along the highway shoulders, that is a very certain issue that compared to areas where there might be more uncertainty, such as a situation where you have hundreds of people on a popular beach. It might be uncertain about if this is compromising people's experience quality or if visitors are perfectly happy in this scenario. Another uncertain issue might be in a park that allows dogs to be off leash. You might be uncertain about if this is causing impacts to wildlife or to the quality of visitor experience. The fourth consideration is stakeholder involvement. So we want to think about how involved are stakeholders in the issue. When you have high stakeholder interest and concern, you need to spend more time and effort to describe and analyze the problem, as well as in vetting and choosing management alternatives, because those decisions are subject to much more scrutiny. On the screen or on the slide here, we see an example of a hypothetical issue where a mark is indicated on the scale here, from low on the left to high on the right. And these marks indicate the level of each of these factors that we just discussed. And then you can see kind of shaded in purple a representation of where this project lands on the sliding scale when we consider all four issues. And ultimately here, the reason that it's called a sliding scale is that you're going to scale your level of effort, data collection, and analysis to the nature and magnitude of the problem you're trying to address. And this is a really key concept in the framework to help to make data collection and visitor use monitoring more efficient and better scaled to the resources available as well. All right, so that was an overview of the visitor use management framework. Now we will get into a more detailed discussion and examples of desired conditions, indicators, and measures, which are key in step 2 of the framework, where we are defining our desired conditions and determining how we're going to monitor those long term. So desired conditions are goal statements about resource conditions, visitor experience, and park facilities. When you're writing these, typically you would ask yourself things like, what experience do visitors in 10 years expect to find here? What do you tell people about this place? And what is meaningful or appealing about a specific zone of the park that differs from others? You might also get inspiration or have desired conditions already in your general plan or in other foundational or visioning documents for the park. This table shows 3 examples of desired conditions from a project that we all worked on at Big Basin Redwood State Park in 2023. These desired conditions came from the park's general plan, as well as a 2022 Reimagining Big Basin Vision Summary. We also consulted park specialists in park planning, natural resources, cultural resources, visitor services, and interpretation and visitor education to refine and add to the desired conditions. So here I have just 3 examples from a very large list that we came up with. The first is that visitors who travel to Big Basin can access the park and experience the redwoods rather than being turned away. The second is that visitation levels are high and encounters with other visitors are frequent. In this case, we were working within the main day use area. So you might have different desired conditions based on this, or this is a good example of where you might have different desired conditions based on the zone of the park. So very different expectations for visitation levels in the main day use zone compared to in a wilderness or backcountry zone. And then our third example here is that visitors experience the awe and splendor of old growth redwood trees. The next step is to think about indicators and measures. Indicators are the variables that we can measure to track desired conditions. They can be social, physical, or ecological. And then the measures are the standard unit that we're using to measure those indicators. So here we have those same 3 desired condition examples from before. And now we've added in columns for their corresponding indicators and measures. So if we look at this first desired condition about being able to access the park and not being turned away, you can see that we have 2 indicators listed. The first is vehicles at one time, or VAOT, and this could be measured as the vehicles present during a parking lot count. The second indicator is the number, or is visitors turned away, with the measure of the number of vehicles turned away per day. This is a good example of the fact that you can have multiple potential indicators for the same desired condition. And so in some projects or many cases, you'll have to work to refine your indicators and really make sure that you're using appropriate indicators to measure that desired condition, and also indicators that can be tracked and analyzed reliably. The second desired condition also has two potential indicators. The first is people at one time, or PAOT. So a measure would be, say we were measuring the number of people present at an attraction. At Big Basin, this might be the viewing point for the mother of the forest tree. And then a second indicator would be encounters, with the measure being the number of people encountered on a hiking trail. The first two desired conditions here in this table are measured observationally. So all of these indicators that we're measuring are observational based indicators. The last desired condition here is about visitor experience. And those types of desired conditions are typically best measured through surveys where you can directly ask the visitor about their experience. And so here in this example, we have visitor satisfaction as our indicator. And so what this might look like in practice in the actual survey instrument is that you might have a question that asks visitors to rate how satisfied they were with their experience viewing the old growth redwood trees on a scale from -2, which is very unsatisfied, to 2, which is very satisfied. And then here's an example where we have different potential measures to use for that indicator. So we could look at either the mean satisfaction rating or at the percent of our survey respondents who are very or extremely satisfied. And these are, sorry to go backwards, these indicators and measures are what you would base your monitoring program around. When we're thinking about this, we can also think about thresholds, which are set for each indicator. So this is, to set a threshold, we ask what is an acceptable level of impact? And then the threshold would be the minimally acceptable conditions for each indicator. And these are set typically using data and professional judgment. So it's typically not advisable to set these ahead of data collection. And the idea with thresholds is that if conditions reach this threshold where they're at the last level of the condition that is acceptable to visitors, that would require a management action to move back towards the desired condition. Another strategy with this is to set triggers ahead of the threshold. So these would be lines where if your monitoring data showed that conditions were at a trigger point, that would lead to action to prevent further decline and to prevent conditions from reaching the threshold. So here is our same table, now with some potential thresholds added. These are not thresholds that have been adopted anywhere or at Big Basin, which we're using for the example. We're just using them here to illustrate what a threshold might look like for the given indicators and measures that we've been talking about. So if we think about our vehicles at one time indicator, a threshold for that might be that the parking lot is less than 85% full on 90% of days. For our visitors turned away indicator, we might set a threshold of on less than 10% of high use season days, we have five or more vehicles turned away. And so that's kind of considering the entire high use season. We expect people to be turned, or vehicles to be turned away at some points, but we don't want it to cross this threshold of what we've deemed as unacceptable, or the minimum acceptable condition. For our people at one time indicator, a threshold might be that there are less than 100 people at a viewpoint, or this attraction viewpoint on 90% of the high use season days. For encounters on a hiking trail, we might set a threshold of encountering less than 30 people on the trail over 90% of the season days. And then for visitor satisfaction, for our mean satisfaction measure, we could set a mean satisfaction threshold of 1 or on that -2 to 2-point scale. Or we could set a threshold that 90% or more of visitors are very or extremely satisfied. And this is a good example of the different types of thresholds you can set. So generally, it's a good idea to use percentages or frequencies when setting thresholds rather than a mean value, just because mean values are a bit harder to interpret and a little bit less intuitive in this case. And so now we think a bit about how we can use the data that are being collected during visitor use monitoring to inform management decisions. Some examples of this here, if we're collecting data about vehicles at one time, that can help to inform parking reservation systems, which are being implemented more and more. And so an example with that is that if we're monitoring a parking lot where reservations are required, and that parking lot is consistently under capacity, say it's at 50% capacity typically, an action that corresponds to that would be to increase the number of reservations available for that lot. When we're monitoring people at one time, one use of that would be to inform your strategy for communicating with visitors about high and low use times to visit the park or to visit a certain area. If we're thinking about a non-compliant behavior, for example, having dogs off leash in an area that requires dogs to be on leash, those findings might help you to think about where you're going to focus staff presence in order to combat areas that have a lot of non-compliance. And then if we think about monitoring for social trails, if we identify areas that have social trails, we can prioritize those areas for restoration projects. Oh, great. And so that was a little bit of information or of an overview on using the framework. But the reality of this is that oftentimes when we're trying to implement the framework, we're doing so with fairly limited financial or staff resources. And one of the big goals of our project is to help provide guidance and tools for units that want to use the framework, but that have limited time, money, and personnel to put towards monitoring. Our team has considerable experience with various parks and areas that have conducted visitor use monitoring within these kind of constraints. So I'll walk you through a couple of examples of projects that Dr. D'Antonio and Dr. Hall have worked on. And these examples do a good job of representing the trade-offs between data quantity and representativeness and the available resources for monitoring. And they're really guided by that concept of the sliding scale that we talked about earlier. Both of these examples included monitoring of indicators that were related to visitor experience, facility capacity, and resource impacts. The first example is in Yellowstone National Park. This is a project that Dr. D'Antonio worked on, and to kind of set the, or describe the setting. Yellowstone National Park has seen massive increases in recreation in recent years. And the park's layout and transportation network tend to create bottlenecks, which lead to congestion and crowding at various sites, as well as resource impacts like social trails or disturbances to wildlife. Along with this, monitoring visitor use and associated impacts was a really important piece of visitor use management at Yellowstone. However, that monitoring is labor, cost, and time intensive, especially when we're thinking about a large park like Yellowstone. And the question in this project was, how can we be creative, thoughtful, and intentional while being publicly defensible in our monitoring approaches within this context where we have limited resources? And so in this project, the team embraced the idea of community science, which is using volunteers or members of the public to collaborate with scientists and collect research data. And so in this case, Yellowstone National Park and Oregon State University collaborated with the Yellowstone Youth Conservation Corps, or crews, which were crews of students who were in the park each week and had time available to collect some monitoring data. The Yellowstone Project does a good job of illustrating some of the challenges associated with using community scientists to gather data. So for this particular group, there was a different group of students in the Corps each week. So that required regular training and having simple protocols that could be easily picked up and implemented. The youth also only worked on weekdays, which meant that the project team needed to find logical ways to describe or infer weekend use. And the Youth Conservation Corps had a break between sessions in mid-July. So that meant that professional expertise was required to talk about season-long patterns because there was that break in data collection. And so these are ways that the team addressed these challenges. One thing they did was that they hired a consistent intern who assisted with the project all summer long. And that helped to ensure high quality data collection and provided this consistent on the ground eyes and ears for the project to sort of standardize data collection across the season. To help with the non-continuous data collection by crews, the project team used these relatively inexpensive automated trail counters, and that helped to overcome gaps in the data record. And this is especially helpful when you can establish relationships between key variables to kind of look at other non-continuous variables in those missing times. And then lastly, the data collection techniques were adapted to fit the skills of field technicians in order to ensure that reliable data could be obtained. And so that's a good example of those trade-offs that are made between data quality and like the specificity of measures that you can collect and the amount of resources you have available and who is available to collect the data. And so this worked really well, and Yellowstone has continued monitoring since 2019. They rotate monitoring sites and focus on establishing trends before establishing thresholds. Another example that I'll walk you through shows how a monitoring program can be tailored to fit into existing staff duties. This is a project that Dr. Hall and Dr. D'Antonio worked on, and it's featured as a case study in the toolkit if you want to take a deeper dive into this monitoring program. This project took place at Golden Gate National Recreation Area, where there is a long history of tension over visitor use. Golden Gate is really woven into the geography of San Francisco, and it's one of the most heavily used parks in the National Park Service. The park has always allowed dogs in many units, and in some cases, the dogs can be off leash. The park also permits commercial dog walking. And so the park was really interested in being able to monitor the potential impacts that all of this dog-related use has on visitor experience, as well as sensitive habitats at the park. Because this was a controversial issue, Golden Gate falls higher on that sliding scale that we talked about earlier and required a more intensive monitoring effort. The approach that the project team took in this case was to start by reviewing existing policy, management reports, and published studies. They also consulted specialist consultants at this point. And then they developed this an extensive list of candidate measures that they ran through a filter of key criteria in order to choose the specific measures that they would monitor. This led to the selection of a handful of observation observational monitors, and a few survey-based measures. Some examples of the measure or of the indicators used were dogs off leash, dog waste, people at one time, and visitor experience of conflict, which would be that one of those survey-based indicators. To develop a monitoring program, the team had to make trade-offs between staff time and travel logistics. So one way that they combated that was to bundle sites within Golden Gate for monitoring. So they bundled sites that were nearby each other to make that more efficient for staff. They also spent time making sure that their protocols were reliable and testing and refining those measures. And then another strategy that they used related to their sampling plan was that they randomly sampled weekday and weekend strata throughout the summer. They limited, or instead of doing that, they initially limited sampling to identify potential problems. So that's a good example of a tiered approach where we're starting with a small sample and then collecting more intensive data later if conditions merit that. So a couple or a few challenges in this study. One is that this is a very large and complex park. And that really emphasized the need to be efficient with data collection. Because the project needed to use existing staff, it was limited by staff availability. And there was a lot of public controversy surrounding some of these elements, for example, dogs. And then the last challenge was that some of the issues that the park was interested in were very rare. So a good example of this was dog bites. And so those were very inefficient to monitor because observers spent a lot of time without seeing those rare occurrences. And so lessons learned and things that helped to address the challenges here. The first was to really, again, like carefully select potential measures based on resources and feasibility, as well as reliability. They ensured that publicly acceptable techniques were used. So for example, cameras were considered to monitor some of those less frequent events, but that was dismissed because of privacy concerns. To help with the scale of the project, they selected key indicator locations for monitoring rather than randomly selecting locations throughout the entire area. And overall, they worked to balance these practical realities with scientific rigor. So these are just two examples of strategies that can be used to combat some of those limited resources. We took what we learned at Big Basin and in these other visitor use management projects to create visitor use management training materials that can be used statewide throughout California state parks. We tailored these materials based on responses from California State Park staff during a statewide survey in the summer of 2023. And this toolkit also is really full of the considerations for thinking about the sliding scale and where your data collection needs fall within that scale. To give a quick overview of the toolkit, it contains webinar recordings focused on mobile data and big data, which are growing in popularity and in use as ways to collect data. So we have a really good webinar about some considerations when using those data sources. We also have a webinar about the basics of using surveys, which again are the most effective way to ask direct questions about visitor experience. And then we have a webinar recording focused on how to measure and use attendance data in this framework. We have a collection of fact sheets, and then also a catalog of existing visitor use monitoring protocols that with tips and considerations for implementing those protocols in your own parks. We have a way to share and view other case studies, so other examples of parks where visitor use management framework has been used. And then we have a list or many links to other resources for you all as you look into these topics. And I'll close by saying that our team from Oregon State, Parks California, and California State Parks is really excited about these topics and happy to connect with you if you have questions about the framework or about implementing this in California State Parks. So our contact information is here, and definitely feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you very much for listening to this webinar, which gave an introduction of the Visitor Use Management Framework.